Good evening and welcome to the 2023 Walton Lecture on Science and Religion. Many of you know me, but my name is Peter van der Berg and I'm chairing the Committee for Christians in Science Ireland, which is organizing the Walton Lectures. We're a local group of Christians in science based in the United Kingdom and Ireland. We welcome Professor Paul Ewart, who will give the 2023 Walton Lecture shortly. Before I introduce Professor Ewart, I want to say a few words about the Walton Lectures. These lectures are named after Ernest Walton, who was Professor of Physics at Trinity College in Dublin. Ernest Walton shared the 1951 Nobel Prize in Physics with John Crofton for the nuclear physics experiments they did at the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge University. Walton was a long-time member of the Methodist Church, and following the award of the Nobel Prize, he spoke on religion and science and religion in various locations. And at this point, we want to thank Marion and Derek Woods in Belfast. Marion is Walton's daughter, and on behalf of the Walton families, he has agreed that we could use Walton's name for these lectures. We're delighted that Professor Ewart has agreed to give the 2023 Walton Lecture on the topic of science and faith. Paul Ewart has obtained Bachelor of Science and Doctor of Philosophy degrees in physics from Queen's University in Belfast. He has been an ERC Advanced Fellow at the Blackett Laboratory at Imperial College of Science and Technology in London. In 1979, he moved to the Physics Department at Oxford University, where he has become Professor of Physics and Head of the Department of Atomic and Laser Physics. He is now Emeritus Professor at Oxford University. He has held visiting professorships at the Joint Institute of Laboratory Astrophysics at the University of Colorado in Boulder in the United States, at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and at the University of Otago in New Zealand. Paul Ewart is a former director of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in Cambridge, and he is the current chair of Christians in Science. The title of Professor Ewart's lecture tonight is Faith in Science, the Relevance of Science for Christian Belief.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that introduction, and may I also thank Peter and the committee for inviting me to give this Walton lecture. I really do consider it an honour and a privilege to be here in Dublin giving this lecture in memory of Sir Ernest Walton. I have I could have claimed some connection with the Waltons since I have an uncle and aunt who were called Walton, so maybe we are related in some way. But I actually did meet Professor Walton's grandson when he was also a physicist, and when he was working for a short time in Oxford, and we overlapped for a bit of that time. So that's the extent of my connection with the Walton family, but it's a privilege to be here, and I want to thank you especially for coming tonight, because it just wouldn't be the same if you weren't here, so thank you for coming. Now, you may be forgiven if you were to look at the title that we have here, Faith in Science, suggesting that there's a certain degree of ambiguity in that title. And even when we give the subtitle, as it were, the relevance of science for Christian faith, there's possibly at least two meanings one could give to this title, Faith in Science. Of course, there's the kind of obvious one, which is that, in the first case, that science has an element of faith built into it, as it were. We need faith to do science at all. So faith plays some kind of part in the scientific enterprise. Now, of course, some of our atheist colleagues would object immediately to that, and we'll come to that in a moment. But there's a second meaning, of course, too, and that is that we can put our faith in science. We can trust science, because it is said that science is really the only way we can know anything for sure. It tells us all we need to know on earth, and all we need to know. So that's two possible interpretations of that title, Faith in Science. And really, the ambiguity there was deliberate, because I'm going to talk about both of them. And, of course, to begin with, Richard Dawkins, who's famous for being militantly atheistic and treating science as the only way that you can know anything, and that, in contrast, faith and religion is a superstition and it's outdated, and it's actually worse than that, according to Dawkins, faith is the great cop-out. the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. And that's a worldview, if you like, that has become very common in our cultures, both in Ireland and in the United Kingdom. Basically, they're saying that faith has no place at all in science. Science deals with facts, things that we can know, things that we can test, and it's the only thing that we can really be sure of, whereas faith involves a kind of blind step of accepting things for which there's no evidence, and even in fact, perhaps in spite of the evidence, according to Dawkins and his colleagues. Now, that's one view of one scientist. Perhaps many scientists think that way, but not all of them. In fact, I can give you a quotation, which I'm about to, from one of the most famous scientists of all in modern physics, and none other than Max Planck. Max Planck was the originator of the whole idea of quantum theory, the most successful theory of anything that we have developed in human history. And he wrote this: "Anybody who has been seriously engaged in scientific work of any kind realizes that over the entrance to the gates of the temple of science are written the words, 'Ye must have faith.'" So what Planck is really getting at here is that doing science at all demands a certain element of faith. And we're going to explore what that could mean in tonight's lecture. And what I want you to do to begin with is really to do something quite difficult, and that is to imagine you don't live in today's culture or society surrounded by media, newspapers, books, television, films that just seem to assume that science has disproved the existence of God and that religion and faith is a delusion and better done without. Think your way back to a culture where the world around looks chaotic, random, and we feel ourselves to be at the mercy of capricious gods who deliver tragedy and bounty as at their whim. We're at the mercy of capricious gods, and that we can't predict what they're going to do. Of course, there are regular things like the rising and setting of the sun and the cycle of the seasons, but there are major life-changing events like sickness, death, wars, catastrophes that are visited upon us for no apparent reason. It looks like we are subject to the whim of capricious gods. So that far from our life being potentially predictable, we are subject to whatever the gods might choose to do. Here's a statue from that time in Greco-Roman culture of the god Zeus carrying off a female captive to Mount Olympus against her will, and no doubt for him to have his way with her. So that life and death was at the mercy of these gods, and that the natural elements, the sun, the moon, and stars, and even mountains, had divine properties that had to be assuaged. Behind that as well, other cultures, both before that and since, had the view that basically everything is fundamentally chaotic, that we're subject to random events and things that happen to us without any cause. This was the worldview of the Babylonian Empire, the Sumerians, where they viewed the world around us, the whole universe, as a conflict between the gods, particularly Marduk, who conquers the chaos of the world, represented here in this relief by Tiamat, who was the personification of chaos, and giant sea monster. And Marduk, by killing that monster, gave birth to order and control in our world. And that kind of pervasive idea that the gods themselves had to deal with chaos. Chaos was the natural state of the universe. Things happened at random for no reason. And so with that kind of worldview, there was no point in trying to work out what was going to happen, because there's no way you could tell. It was random or chaotic, or it was at the will of some capricious god. There's no sense of being able to predict things. That's in great contrast now, I think, of the God that's introduced by the Hebrew people, the God of the Bible. Here we find a God who is presented as the one who creates everything that we can see. Everybody is perhaps familiar with the opening verses of the Bible in the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Let me just give you a clue there, as I've suggested here in the slide, that the waters, the sea, was for the Hebrews symbolic of chaos and disorder. And so here we see that chaos being part of the initial creation that God brought into existence. And the Spirit of God was working upon that initial chaos. So even the chaos was a creation of God. More importantly, as we read further in Genesis, we find out that the moon and the stars, the sun and the moon, are not gods. They're just lights that God put into the sky for our convenience, as it were. And that there are no gods in mountains or animals or nature at all, that they're all creations of the one God who made everything for his purpose. This is perhaps summed up neatly in a quotation by Charles Hummel, who wrote this: "By purging the cosmic order of all gods and goddesses, the Genesis creation account de-divinized nature, took the gods out of nature. And that made way for a science that can probe and study every part of the universe without fearing either trespass or retribution." So basically what he's saying is that we have, as human beings, nothing to fear from studying, even doing experiments on nature to find out how it works. They're not gods in any sense at all. They're all creations of the one God. And more than that, having taken that step of faith, you can now sensibly start to look for some kind of order that might be in it. The whole tenor of the book of Genesis and those opening chapters is one of God creating in an orderly fashion. And there's some sense in that ordering that God is in control of things and things are being made for a purpose in the overall plan that God has. And it's therefore makes sense for us to try to find out what that order is and what it might mean. So that laid the groundwork, if you like. That change in worldview meant that it was a sensible thing to do to start to look for order in the universe. And this gradually over the centuries, beginning with the initial ideas of the Greeks, but they didn't take it very far. But really in the early Middle Ages, philosophers start to think about how God might be making the world in a way that we could understand, that it must fit with some kind of rational understanding. And therefore, when we get to the age of Kepler, Johannes Kepler, who was the one who, studying the data from observations of how the planets moved amongst the fixed stars, laid down sets of mathematical rules that were ultimately explained by Newton's theory of gravitation. But it was Kepler who really ordered it by saying they followed a mathematical formula. And he said this: "The chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God, and which he has revealed to us in the language of mathematics." Now, what I want you to notice here in what Kepler is saying, he's saying two things. First of all, that there's a rational order in the world to be discovered. You may look around the world, it may look random. You know, things, the cloud shapes, patterns in the woodland floor, pebbles on a beach, all looks random. But actually, when you look a bit deeper, there is an underlying order to things. And it makes sense to look for that because it was made by God in a rational way. The second thing to note from what he says is that we have a language of mathematics that helps us understand and describe this order that is actually present. And so this whole idea of faith in the created order is the basis for science studies itself. Faith in the created order gives us the basis for science. It's now worth looking for that order. And we've got a language, mathematics, with which we can describe it quantitatively. So this idea of having a mathematical language also tells me something actually quite profound. And this has struck also other physicists and scientists who have looked at this problem or this issue and wondered why mathematics works so well. Why does it allow us to predict eclipses, weather patterns? All sorts of unpredictable things can now be understood mathematically and predictions made with some accuracy and precision. This was pointed out actually nearly 100 years ago by one of the greatest modern theoretical physicists, Eugene Wigner, and he wrote this in a fascinating essay on the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the physical sciences. He writes this: the miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. Now, as far as I know, Wigner was not a man of any particular religious faith, and yet he uses this word miracle to describe this strange feature that humans have to be able to describe the world around us with mathematical precision. And that word miracle is deliberate, I think, because it points to a kind of transcendent quality that our rationality has to be able to understand the world around us. And I take mathematics to be emblematic of our rationality, the fact that we can think logically, evaluate evidence, and come to logical conclusions. And that's something that we take for granted, but we shouldn't, actually. The ability to understand the world around us is a profound problem philosophically. Why should that be? Nonetheless, people have taken this idea that we have this rational ability to understand the order that's in the world and trace it back to the insight that a biblical worldview gives from the Judeo-Christian view. This is expressed by Carl von Weizsäcker, who's a physicist and philosopher, and he writes this: the concept of exact mathematical laws of nature, which was only dimly present in Greek thought, gained far greater convincing power by means of the Christian concept of creation. It was a sort of Christian radicalism which transformed nature from the house of gods into the realm of law. And the interesting thing is, now that we are able to formulate laws of nature and find that nature does obey laws, the existence of these laws, does it not imply a lawgiver? From where did these laws come? Why should the universe and nature be describable in the mathematical way that it is, that there are these natural laws? A consequence of this, of course, is that when we look at what God has made in his world, we have the incentive, as it were, the encouragement to learn something about its maker, that the world around us can tell us something about God. The Bible also points us, does it not, to seeing God's world and the firmament, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament declares his handiwork, so that we can see God's actions in the world around us. God reveals himself in what he has made in the natural world. And therefore, for the early church fathers and for theologians through the ages, they have made this connection between understanding what we can know about God through his creation, through his world, and what he has revealed to us through his word, the Bible. And because truth must be coherent and consistent, then what we learn about God in the world must be consistent with what we learn about God in his word, the Bible. And this is summed up in Augustine's famous saying, all truth is God's truth. Truth that we discover by our scientific studies is valid as much as the truth we discover about God in his revealed word or by our experience of his Spirit in our lives. So this idea that we can use reason to help us understand more about God is actually a very profound and helpful idea. And it's been there right from the beginning of the Christian church, that even the early church fathers used evidence-based reasoning to help understand the scripture and to work out which part of the Old Testament were meant to be taken literally and which were allegorical. They used ideas of physical impossibility and contradictions to help them interpret the scriptures in a way that was consistent and fell together with what they observed in the world. This is expressed quite well by Thomas Aquinas, who wrote this. But basically, his writings in his great theological work covered the whole idea whether we could use human reason to learn anything about God. And he argued very strongly that human reason is reliable up to a point that it can discover truths about God, his creatures, the human soul, and the moral precepts of the natural law. So that by using our rational faculties, we can actually learn how to understand Scripture and more about God. That our reason is a valid authority. So having said that, what do we then find when we look at the world that God has made? Not just the world, but the universe. I could give you a whole lecture tonight about the fascinating things that we find scientifically that are significant in my mind and in the minds of many others, that we're not looking at a totally random situation, but there appears to all intents and purposes to be a mind behind the universe. We find in particular that our universe is fine-tuned for life, that there are a number, actually quite a number of remarkable coincidences, things that are quite independent, that have to be just right for us to be here tonight discussing this question. The best model we have of how the universe came into existence following what we now know as what we call the Big Bang was that things are started off in such a way that the forces of nature, particularly gravity, which holds things together, and the other forces between the atomic particles that make up the nucleus and atoms and molecules and you and me, all these different forces have strengths, and their relative strengths determine how things behave. For example, if gravity had been just a little bit, a tiny bit stronger, then we wouldn't be here. Because after the Big Bang, gravity would have pulled all that matter back together again in a huge crunch. And that would have happened long before any stars had formed, any of the heavy elements like carbon that go to make up you and me. We would never have appeared had gravity been just a tiny bit stronger. If gravity had been a tiny bit weaker, then stuff would have continued to expand, and matter would never have coalesced into stars in order to create the heavy elements like carbon that make up you and me and everything that we see around. So gravity had to be just the right value to see the universe persist for long enough for stars to evolve, for heavy elements to create it in their interiors, for them to be blown out into space in supernovae, to reform as stars and galaxies and planets and the Earth and you and me eventually. So these forces had to be exactly right in order for us to be here. That human life is dependent on a remarkable series of such coincidences. I've mentioned carbon, for example. There's actually more carbon in the universe than there ought to be according to the usual laws of physics. Because carbon is made by the collision of 3 helium atoms, which collide together at the same time as stick. Now, of course, atoms bounce into each other all the time. But to get 3 to collide simultaneously is much more rare. And for them then to stick together is remarkable. They might just bounce off each other. It turns out that the forces between the nuclear particles and the electrical forces that exist as well are such that there's a kind of natural resonance when 3 of these helium atoms come together. And they quite like it. They sort of resonate. And they hang around for long enough for them to stick. And that creates more carbon than we would expect by the normal process of elemental formation in the center of stars. And when actually an atheist astrophysicist, Fred Hoyle, looked at this issue, he wondered, why is there so much carbon? And so he predicted that there must be this resonance. And he did the sums, and what do you know? There was the resonance. But when you took the forces at the strength that they had, the resonance had to appear. And this struck Hoyle as being remarkable. Hoyle was an atheist. He believed that the universe didn't have a beginning. It was eternal. It had always existed, because a creation sounded a bit too religious. And so he believed in the eternity of matter. But in order to explain the amount of carbon, he realized that something funny was going on, and he wrote this: a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect, a mind if you like, a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics, and the numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. So here was an atheist forced by the science itself to postulate a mind behind the universe. And so there was evidence, even in the very science he was studying, that was pointing to the existence of God, pointing to the creation of matter at some point in the past. A pointer to the existence of God. Now, of course, this didn't convince Hoyle to become a believer. He continued, as far as we know, to be an atheist. And, of course, when you look at the evidence in any situation, we do bring our own personal ideas and wishes and desires to interpret that evidence. And we're not always as easily convinced as we ought to be in a rational way. I think Aquinas had another observation of human nature when he wrote this as in regard to our treatment of evidence before us. He said, "For those with faith, no evidence is necessary, and for those without it, no evidence will suffice." Now, of course, most of us are somewhere in the middle, aren't we not? We may believe that we have faith in spite of evidence or without evidence, but actually we have some evidence. We have the Bible that we've read, we've observed the effect of God in other people's lives, we see the world around us, we have some evidence whether we like it or not, and we interpret that in some way. So we have some evidence to go on. We've got the historical accounts of Jesus and so on. But of course, no matter how much evidence you have, if you are not prepared to accept what it might be pointing to, then no evidence will be a totally convincing proof for you. And I think we can discuss the reasons for that later. But what I want to say just at this point is that it's really remarkable, is it not, that we can understand anything about the universe at all. That when we look about ourselves and look into the deepest recesses of the universe, we're able to see law and order and a rational system at work here. And that's a remarkable feat for such a tiny thing as a human brain, is it not? Even all the human brains that have existed, put them together, it's a tiny amount of mass compared to the universe. And yet we have worked out quite a bit about how the universe works. There's still a lot we don't know, but nonetheless, it's remarkable that we can understand anything about how the world works because it looks totally random and chaotic. But we've discovered this order. And it was another, perhaps the most famous scientist of the last century, Albert Einstein, who noted in regard to this that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. Einstein was a very profound thinker, and he wasn't a believer in a personal God, but nonetheless, he was in one sense a profoundly religious thinker, that he thought there was more to the world than meets the eye. How is it that we can understand things? For someone who is not a theist, who believes there's nothing other than what we can see around us, then this is a difficult problem. But of course, it fits well into the Christian view of the world because, as we read at the beginning of John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word. And the Greek word for that was logos. And the word logos was with God, and the word logos was God. So this word was the creative force and power and person who brought things into existence. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made. And for the Greeks, the word logos carried the connotation of the underlying rational principle of the world and the universe. That logos was the rational principle underlying all that exists. So here, John is saying that God is rational, that he thinks in a rational way, and we are made in his image. There's something about us that enables us to communicate and have a relationship with God. We can reason, we can think about God and come to take that point of making a step of faith or not, depending on the evidence and how we read it. So that this makes sense for the theist of why we can understand things at all, because we are in some sense made in God's image. There's something about us that allows us to connect with God. So as we've seen here, as we look into science and see these kind of remarkable coincidences that point to God, then it gives us a sense that there's more to science than meets the eye at first. And this was expressed by Francis Bacon, who many people acknowledge as the father of experimental science. He was the one who said it's okay to do experiments on science, on the natural world. You don't have to be afraid. There's no God going to bite you if you examine things. And so experimental science developed out of the philosophy of Francis Bacon, and he wrote this: "A little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism." Philosophy for Bacon was what we would today call science. So a little science inclines you to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's mind about to religion. So he emphasizes, if you will, what I'm saying, that science itself points back to faith in a consistent and coherent way. So, in conclusion, if you were, to the first part of my talk, sorry, it's going to go on a bit longer, I want to just summarize that in the first instance, that faith in science, the first sense of that phrase, the first meaning that we can take from it is that faith in a creator God, was in fact the foundation for what we call science today. Without that faith, there would be no point in even embarking upon the search for order in the world or the laws of nature. And so when we start that process of investigating nature, we find there is order to be found there. And what we see has all the imprints, all the fingerprints, if you like, all the signs of mind, what Hoyle called that super intellect, who'd been monkeying with the physics and arranging things so that we'd be here. So the evidence from science itself points back to God. So what we have here is that a coherent, consistent picture of faith in science. It makes sense. It coheres together. It doesn't present us with a proof that God exists, but it gives us a rational basis for belief in God. And upon that rational basis, we can decide how we can live our lives, what we'll do with that evidence. So let's turn our minds now from that first idea that faith in the Creator God will give that foundation, and the evidence from science points back to God, to the second interpretation or meaning of that phrase, faith in science, that science is really the only thing that can tell us the truth, the only thing that we can trust. And religion and faith is superstition and not based on facts. It's a blind step of faith, not based on any evidence or reason or logic. So this interpretation, this worldview that's based on science in the way, would want to say to us that science is all we need to have faith in. Because at the end of the day, we're just chance products of a purposeless process. It started with the Big Bang, and it's just been random and unpurposeful ever since then. And at the end of the day, when we examine ourselves and get right back down to things, we're just made of atoms and molecules, stuff, and that's all we are. We're nothing but atoms and molecules. And this pervasive worldview can be described by the word scientism. It's a kind of doctrine, if you like, a worldview that science tells you that all the truth that we need to know and that we can know about the world. And the rather depressing conclusion of this worldview, of this scientism, is that life has no meaning or purpose because we are simply an accident of how the world and the universe happen to evolve. And when we get right down to it, when you reduce things, we're just atoms and molecules. This was expressed quite eloquently by a very seminal book written by the early 1950s, 1960s by Jacques Monod, who was a Nobel Prize winner in molecular biology. And he wrote this book called The Chance and Necessity, about the theory of evolution, explaining how life forms have evolved from one from the other, from simpler to more complex systems and animals, and that we are just one of those products of that evolutionary process. And his conclusion is this, that man at last knows he is alone in the unfeeling immensity of the universe, out of which he has emerged by chance. So that's a rather bleak interpretation of our existence, that there's no meaning or purpose to our lives because we're just an accidental byproduct of an impersonal process that didn't have us in mind and no purpose for our being here. And so it all boils down to chance, a random accident, if you will. Now, of course, if you actually start to think a bit more deeply about that, which is what I want to encourage you to do, And everyone should try to think a little bit more deeply, especially when scientists are making philosophical or metaphysical statements. What does that actually mean, that we have emerged by chance? Well, it turns out that a colleague in Oxford, Professor Sir Roger Penrose, who's a mathematician, who worked with Stephen Hawking on the model of the Big Bang, so he's a clever man, and he's not a person of faith, as far as I know. He has no religious convictions, but he actually did the calculations on the cosmology of the universe, how we got to be where we are, starting from the Big Bang. Because when we look around the universe, we see a certain amount of order. Planets have come together and they behave in an orderly way at some parts. Other places it looks chaotic. So there's a mixture of order and disorder in the universe. And there's what we call entropy, the measure of the disorder. And so you can, in principle, calculate the amount of disorder, what scientists call entropy, the degree of disorder in any system. And Penrose has done the calculations, and he's worked out how ordered the world, the universe, had to be at the beginning in order to be where we are now with a certain amount of order and disorder. How ordered did it start off with? Because things are getting disordered as time goes on. You put some milk into your tea and it spreads out. The milk never goes back together again and jumps out of the cup. That's disorder. So disorder is always increasing. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Things decay and become more random and chaotic. And the universe evolves in that direction. It tells us the direction of time, the increase of disorder. So when Penrose did the calculation, he worked out how ordered the world had to be in order to be where we are now. And sorry? I'm going to tell you that. Okay. The degree of order that had to be present at the Big Bang is this number. 1 in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. Sorry if that looks a bit funny, but visualize it as a 10 with 122 noughts after it. So I couldn't put that on one slide. So this is a simple way of writing this huge number, okay? That's the degree of precision of order that had to be present at the beginning of the universe to have the world we see around us today. Now, I'm a physicist, and I don't take this number particularly seriously. It's a cosmology number, but it's a big number. It may be 100 or a million times bigger or smaller, but it's huge. This number is bigger than the total number of protons and neutrons in the whole universe. Just think about that. We can't imagine a number that big. And yet, this is the precision with which the Creator had to set things off going in order to have the world we have today that enabled us to exist. As I say, Penrose was not a particularly religious person, but he said this: I would say the universe has a purpose. It's not there just somehow by chance. When something is so remarkably improbable, we look for some underlying cause. If you're throwing dice and it keeps coming up with sixes all the time, you begin to think these dice are loaded. There's a reason for that. It isn't purely chance. And so Penrose is saying when you do the numbers, it looks like there's a purpose to the universe just being here. So the first conclusion of scientism, that we are just chance products of a purposeless process, doesn't bear deeper examination. That chance may be involved, but it cannot be the whole story. So there must be something more to it. Let's look at the second conclusion of scientism, that we're nothing but atoms and molecules. When you try to explain things, you reduce it to simpler things. So we explain how things behave by breaking them up into smaller parts or smaller processes until you get right down to atoms and molecules. And the reductionist will tell us that's all we are. We're just a bunch of atoms and molecules. Now, this idea that we're nothing but atoms and molecules essentially misses the point, really, when we're thinking about things a bit more deeply. And this was pointed out by Donald Mackay, who was one of the early leaders in Christians in Science. He was a professor of computing and brain science. And he used this analogy of coming into a room and seeing a blackboard covered with white marks. And to some people, it would say, oh, it's just a blackboard and there's sort of chalk marks on it, and that's all there is. It's nothing but white chalk on a black surface. But of course, a mathematician looking at that would say, hey, no, these are equations. These are telling us relationships between something. And so if you're just saying they're just chalk marks, you're missing the point. And so Mackay calls this the fallacy of nothing buttery. Of course, they are chalk marks on the board, but they're more than that. And it can't be reduced to nothing but atoms and molecules. Now, of course, Mackay was a Christian, and he would say that, wouldn't he? But let me refer you to the writings of an atheist, one J.B.S. Haldane, who was a famous physiologist and molecular biologist. And he wrote this, that remember that if we're nothing but atoms and molecules, then everything about us is just what atoms and molecules do. And that means what's going on in our brains is just what atoms and molecules are doing. They're bumping into each other, and that's all there is to it. And according to Haldane, he said, if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, then I have no reason to suppose my beliefs are true. And hence, I have no reason to suppose my brain to be composed of atoms. So you see the contradiction, that if we're nothing but atoms and molecules, then we can't know that, because our thinking is just what atoms and molecules do, and we can't say that that's true. And that points to a really fundamental philosophical problem for the materialist, the person who thinks that there's nothing more than just atoms and molecules. There are no spiritual realities, there's nothing higher, there's nothing transcendent, there's nothing outside the natural world that we can observe. There's a deep philosophical problem here as well that has an analogy in a formal logical theorem by a man called Kurt Gödel, that some of you may have heard of. Kurt Gödel wrote a mathematical logic theorem in the 1930s, which he called the incompleteness theorem. And he said this, basically, that if you have a logical system, like mathematics, you can make statements within a mathematical or logical system that may be true, but you cannot prove them from within that system on its own. We need something at a higher level to validate the proof of that logical system. So in other words, he's saying that we need something outside the system to validate it. Now, Gödel was actually someone who Einstein thought was the cleverest person he'd ever met. So we have to take this theorem seriously. What I want to suggest here is that in an analogous way that we need a transcendent level at which to validate a mathematical proof or theorem, that applies also ultimately to all the reasoning that we do. That scientism, of course, says that there is nothing beyond our reason and our existence to validate. There's nothing outside the natural system, and therefore there's nothing to validate our rationality. We can't therefore trust our reasoning if they're just the motion of atoms and molecules in our brains. So that's a deep fundamental problem that the materialist faces that is really insuperable from a logical, philosophical point of view. And it's not a new problem. It goes way back to Aristotle, who realized a similar problem when he was dealing with similar ideas that perhaps were just atoms and molecules, essentially. There's just stuff. He used he quoted a proverb, actually, that was circulating at the time, that if a man chokes on water, with what will he wash it down? You see, if your reason is in doubt, you can't use reason to validate it. And materialism puts our reason in doubt by saying we're just nothing but atoms and molecules. There's a fundamental problem there. But that's not a problem for the theist. For the believer in God, the God of reason, because we were made in his image, that ultimately our reason finds its basis in the mind and rationality of God. So there's a limit here to what science can tell us. And we need to be humble enough to realize it. That science can tell us a lot about how the world works, but it gets to a point when it starts to undercut the reason it's using itself. And the methods of science have limitations. And I think this is put very eloquently, but if accidentally, by a comedy duo that you probably need to be at least 50 years old to remember. And this is a couple, George Burns and Gracie Allen, who had a comedy program on American television that we sometimes saw on BBC. And at the end of their comedy show, George and Gracie would come out from behind the curtain onto the stage and have a wee chat about what was going on in their lives. And on one occasion, Gracie says to George, my nephew is doing some scientific research. And George sucked on his guitar and says, that's very interesting, Gracie. What's he doing research on? Oh, said Gracie, he's trying to find out how many people in California have a telephone. That's very interesting, George said. And what did he find out? Well, said Gracie, it was 100%. Wow, said George, how did he find that out? Well, said Gracie, everyone he phoned up had one. So science is extremely powerful at telling us the things that it's capable of discovering and relating within the natural world. But it gets to a point where there are questions it just cannot deal with. It's limited by its methods, and it can discover only the things that the scientific method can find out. So it's not possible for science to conclude that there is no God, that God does not exist, and that all the scientific evidence we are saying proves that God does not exist. That is philosophically not possible, because actually, according to what I've been saying, that science can tell us only what the scientific method can tell us. It can only get out what's been put in there in the first place. And this was expressed very eloquently by an Oxford philosopher, Elizabeth Anscombe. And she wrote this, that this often happens in philosophy. It's argued that all we find is such and such. And it turns out that the arguer has excluded from his idea of finding the sort of thing he says we don't find. Of course, the scientific method excludes God as an explanation, and therefore it can't then conclude that God doesn't exist, because it's built that into its reasoning and its methods. So there's a fundamental limit to what we can use our reason to discover, but that doesn't mean our reason is useless in determining or pointing us towards the truth. And this is well expressed by that wonderful scientist and philosopher Blaise Pascal in his Pensée, and he writes this, that the supreme function of reason is to show man that some things are beyond reason. So we need to realize the limits of our own reason and rationality, but accept it as a gift from God and ask ourselves, what is it telling us and where is it pointing to? So in conclusion, let me say this, that first of all, in the first part, I tried to explain that faith in a creator was what actually led to science in the first place, the modern science that we have today. The faith that there was an order to be discovered and that there's a rational mind behind the universe that was somehow related to our own minds, our own ways of thinking. And so that makes a coherent picture from the Christian faith point of view. It makes sense of science. Secondly, when we do the science, we find lots of evidence that actually points back to the creator himself. It provides evidence. It doesn't provide a mathematical proof, because it can't really do that because of its methods. What we can say, however, is that scientism as a philosophy, as a worldview, doesn't work. It's logically self-defeating. It cuts off the branch it's sitting on. It undermines the validity of our reason itself, if our reason is simply the motion of atoms in our brains. And so when we put all this together, because we can make sense of the world, we have a rational way of thinking that actually helps us understand the world and is verifiable, and it points to a mind behind the universe, I think it provides us then with rational justification. First of all, for that step of faith in investigating order, but also believing in God himself, that it's a rationally justified belief. We don't have 100% proof, like a mathematical theorem, but it's of a different nature. Faith in God is rationally justified. Now, I've admitted, of course, that I can't prove to you in the same way as I could prove Pythagoras' theorem is true, mathematically. I can't prove that God exists. And we want to ask ourselves then, well, if we can't prove God exists or not, is not the most honest position to take that of the agnostic and just shrug our shoulders and say, well, we can't say, we don't know, and we'll never be able to know. Must we remain agnostic in the face of this apparent difficulty? Well, I want to suggest to you that's not where we need to leave it. And in fact, that's not where we leave things as human beings anyway. We don't go through life demanding mathematical proof for every action that we take, for every relationship we enter into. That we begin relationships by taking small steps of faith and build confidence in our friends that grows and reflects back. That the pointers we have, that they're trustworthy and honest, are verified by our experience and so on. So that step of faith is a rational and justifiable thing to do. And it's an important decision that we make in regard to forming relationships, is it not? We don't wait for 100% proof before embarking upon a friendship. And of course, the existence of God, and if he's really there, that surely is one of the most important issues we have to decide for ourselves. And it's not one that we can simply put on the shelf and say it doesn't matter. It's moderately important, but it's not the most important thing to me. Is that really the case? Pascal would give you an argument there. He said, look, you can't avoid this choice. We're here. We have to decide whether God exists or not and what to do with our lives in the light of that decision. He advised taking the bet that God does exist, because you're more to gain than you would to lose if you're wrong. But that's not what I'm saying tonight. I'm saying that we've got a rational basis, even in science, for our faith in God. And that this is a decision that every one of us has to make. And C.S. Lewis puts the issue quite pungently here when he says that Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. And the only thing it cannot be is moderately important. So how are we to decide? We've seen we've got limits to our reason, that we can't prove things absolutely. But are we to leave it there? But supposing there's a question that we can't absolutely resolve by reason alone. C.S. Lewis again has a word of advice, and he says, if reason can't tell you if the cat is in the linen cupboard, it's reason itself that whispers, go and look. So reason is not the only way we can know things or we can discover things. We've looked at science and the pointers that it gives us to God, but that's not the only evidence we have before us. Surely it behoves us to look at other kinds of evidence, other ways of knowing whether this Christianity thing is true or not. Just look at some of the other evidence. I'm not going to do that tonight, but I'll just suggest things that you might consider. First of all, there's the moral sense of right and wrong that's common to all human beings who've ever lived. Of course, we might differ about the number of wives we might have and different cultural things, but there's a general agreement that you can't just have any old woman that you want. There's a sense of rightness and fairness and justice, of goodness, truth, honesty, that's common to all men. We know what love is, we know what justice is, we know what forgiveness is in our hearts. And this moral compass that we have, what the Apostle John refers to as the light that lightens every man, that sense of God's direction of what is right and good, is present in all of us to some degree. And that moral sense that's common to all humanity points us to some objective, absolute standard of what's right and wrong. It can't be purely relative. Then when we look at the historical experience of human beings, of men and women and children down the ages, who have experienced God in different ways and in different cultures and religions, the search for God is a deep-seated desire in all humans. And people who have encountered God to the degree, the best they can, have found their lives changed. That there's something real in this spiritual dimension to our lives that can't be ignored. Then, of course, there's the historical evidence of Jesus, the figure of Jesus that we read about in the New Testament. The evidence of his resurrection that's been analysed over and over again, that is, in a court of law, convincing that something strange happened. And the simplest explanation was that it's true, Jesus did rise from the dead. All the other explanations are more complicated and less plausible. And then finally, I would suggest there's the personal experience that is open to all of us, a kind of experiment that we can all do if we do begin that journey of faith and take that step, that it's possible to know something that reason on its own or science on its own can't tell us. I recall the discussion that the Apostle Paul had when he went to Athens and encountered the philosophers there, the Stoics and the Epicureans, who had various worldviews. one of which was that we're just atoms and it's all a random chance event that we happen to be here and there's nothing special about it. But nonetheless, they had various gods that they were concerned to keep happy. And Paul meets them where they are and said, look, you have this sense that there are gods behind things, but actually you only need to think about the one God who made everything. And he said this to them in his speech at the Areopagus. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples made by human hands. From one man he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth. And God did this. In other words, God created human beings for a purpose. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. So that sense that there's a God behind the universe to be found if only we would look out for him, make that move to find him, is encouraged also, is it not, by the words of the Old Testament Jeremiah, who says, if you really want to know, then you will find out. He said, you will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart, when there's a genuine desire to know the truth, as you're open to the existence of God and what that means for your life. And Jesus himself puts it this way. He said, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. The brother of Jesus, James, wrote to his fellow Christians and to those in the times around them. He said this, that if you draw near to God, he will draw near to you. And that's the promise that Christians have found to be true, that when we seek God with all our hearts, he comes to us and reveals himself to us in our own personal experience, that rationally justified belief is verified by our experience of the love and the grace and the forgiveness and the peace and the joy that God brings into our lives.